I decided to label this talk The Real Fountain of Youth, and in case I succumb to jet lag and start rambling incoherently, I'll give you the punchline, which very much echoes everything that David Willits was saying in the last session, which is that the real fountain of youth is in the same place it's always been, which is the fountain with youth, and in our connections with future generations. It's a truth that's timeless, and it's also probably never been more timely. And I thought I would go back in time and invoke John F. Kennedy, who in 1956, in his mid-30s, was a United States Senator, and he got up and gave a speech in front of the U.S. Senate, and he said that America was wasting resources of incalculable value, the time and talent and experience of older people today. And I'm just shocked at how prescient that was. And then 7 years later, in 1963, in the beginning of the year, the same year where his own life would actually end, he got up in front of Congress again, this time as president, and he said, we'd added years to life. Now it was time to add life to those years. And as we heard this morning from speaker after speaker, we've added approximately 2 years per decade, about 2 months a year to our lifespan, the American lifespan in that period. And then when it comes to JFK's challenge, that second part about the life 2 years, we haven't done nearly so well. We've invested much more in the former and all too little in the latter. And that's created a mismatch with many adverse consequences. We've created essentially, as we've added up all of those months and years over all of those decades, a new season in life. But as one person characterizes it, it's a season in search of a purpose. And what is that purpose of all of these extra years, all of this time that's being added, as Laura Carstenson's pointed out, not to the end of life, but actually to the middle? What's the role of older people in our society, as there's so many more? And that's no longer just a question of individual fulfillment. It becomes a question of how we're going to sustain ourselves in the context of new demographic realities. In 2019 in the US, for the first time ever, and we've heard that setup all day, for the first time ever. Laura talked about, for the first time ever, about us having more people over 60 than under 5. Well, in 2019, there'll be, for the first time ever, more people over 60 than under 18. We really are crossing the Rubicon into a more old than young society. And culturally, that's a shock to the system, and certainly in my country, where we've always upheld youth as a glorious virtue, and we've always thought about ourselves as a young society. And no surprise, there's a lot of concern, a lot of hand-wringing about this gray wave of greedy geezers who will be taking America to the cleaners. There is an ad that's circulating in the US now, leading up to tomorrow's election, of a whole group of dyspeptic older people who are counseling young people not to vote, telling them to stay home. One woman says, climate change, that's a you problem. I'll be dead soon. So it recalls Groucho Marx's wonderful line about posterity. Everybody always talks about posterity. What's posterity ever done for me? And I think that's the way we've tend to think of the older population. In fact, the Atlantic Monthly a few years ago had a cover story about these demographic changes. And this is in advance of all of the scientific breakthroughs we've heard about today, which will make that issue even more dramatic. The title was The Coming Death Shortage. So there is a lot of reason to be concerned. This shift in society is so enormous. There are going to be enormous challenges that go with it, but I'm here to be somewhat optimistic. In fact, quite optimistic. But I still want to try to have some reserve. I keep thinking of, maybe it's being here in the UK, of the first Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. I'm sure many of you have seen that film, and there's a wonderful scene where Penelope Wilton shows up at the Marigold Hotel, and it's this dilapidated mess in sharp contrast to the Photoshop brochure that she had sunk her life savings into, and she's confronting Dev Patel, who's running the hotel, and she says, this is an outrage, and he's trying to calm her down, and he says, don't worry. Here in India, we have an expression, everything works out in the end. So if it hasn't worked out, it's not yet the end. I'm not quite that optimistic, but I think if you shift the lens from cultural stereotypes, that old narrative that we have, even from fiscal woes and other real and important conflicts that we need to address, and you look at emotional truths, the needs and assets of older people and the needs and assets of younger people fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And that's something that I learned through creating a program with Linda Freed, now the dean of the public health school at Columbia, called Experience Corps, to mobilize thousands of older people in 25 cities around the country to help young people read by the third grade. And much investment was made in research from that program, and it showed the mutual benefits through bringing the generations together, but it goes far beyond any particular program. As I was doing that work, I was very much focused on the idea of time and numbers. Young people need support. Older people seem to have this time that's been evoked all through the day. And they certainly have vast numbers. But it goes so much further than that. If you look at developmental psychology and what it has to teach us about what young people need, study after study shows that they need more support from adults who care about them. Yuri Bronfenbrenner, one of the pioneers in child development, has a wonderful expression. He said, what every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. And the longest, most significant longitudinal study of young people growing up under adverse circumstances was conducted by a psychologist at the University of California, Davis, named Emmy Werner, who for 40 years traveled to the Hawaiian island of Kauai to study children growing up in poverty. You figure anybody who can figure out how to go to Kauai for 40 years and write it off has something going for her. But she discovered that the kids who made it, despite grinding poverty and alcohol abuse and other really difficult circumstances, who made it against the odds, had one thing in common, was that adult who was irrationally crazy about them. And a significant percentage, it turns out in Emmy's study, were older people in the community. And if you look at the developmental research on older people, much of it done by Laura Carstensen and other scholars, you realize that older people are built for this role to connect with the younger generation. Somebody invoked socio-emotional selectivity this morning, and that's a theory, to my understanding, that is very much dependent on the idea of time. Not so much time lived, and we've heard a lot about how that's increasing, but equally important, time left to live. As we realize that life doesn't go on forever, even if it might be extended, it changes our priorities. If somebody tells you you have a week left to live, you don't go out and study Mandarin. You connect with the people that you love. You focus on relationships. And so as we get older, not only are we driven towards connection and relationships, but we have a whole set of blossoming skills in that arena. Emotional regulation was invoked this morning, empathy. So older people are not only driven to connect, but they're really good at it. And more than that, there's a direction to that connection, and it's downhill. Erik Erikson, the great psychologist of adult development, said the hallmark of successful development in this stage could be encapsulated in the phrase, I am what survives of me. What we've invested in younger generations, not just leaving a legacy, but actually living one. George Valent, who ran the longest standing, probably most significant study of adult development, the Harvard study of adult development, found that older people who invest in younger ones are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. And he has an exquisite phrase, biology flows downhill. This isn't an accident, it's not a fad, it's something that's deeply built into human nature. So if young people need to be nurtured, if older people need to nurture to connect with the future, if the real fountain of youth is the fountain with youth, David talked about those extra 4 years people are living, if that's one of the keys to happiness in later life, why isn't that this doesn't happen everywhere in daily life? And the reason, quite simply, is that we've thwarted it at every turn. And I don't want to sound like I'm someone who's nostalgic and glorifying the past, but a century ago in the United States, we were the most age-integrated society in the world, or at least one of them. Every aspect of life was characterized by multi-generational connection. People worked together on the farmstead, in one-room schoolhouses, students in their 20s and 30s learned alongside young people. Our people lived in, as I was saying, multi-generational households. They worked side by side with people of different ages. They learned together. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, we undertook a radical social experiment to reshuffle society. And today, we're the most age-segregated society in the world, maybe neck and neck with the UK. And that was a remarkable transformation. And it happened, in many cases, for the most uplifting reasons. We heard about the importance of changes at the beginning of the century and how we dealt with children, child labor laws, universal schooling. They were major steps forward, but they did contribute to further reorganizing society by age. We created a whole new set of institutions, senior centers, nursing homes. Probably the retirement community was the most transformative because it married the idea of radical age segregation with the cultural narrative of recapturing one's youth, the golden years ideal. And those things went hand in hand because if you created age-segregated communities where everyone was old, nobody was old. Right? So you could live out this fantasy of a second youth protected from interaction with actual young people. And there are some tremendously horrific stories about how that played out. One of my, I wouldn't say favorites, but one of the most kind of galvanizing is the story of Youngtown, which was the first retirement community in America segregated by age. It was created outside of Phoenix. It was the first AARP chapter in America, and it was built around, as the name suggests, the idea of recapturing your youth, Youngtown. There was a story that hit the media a couple decades ago about a couple in Youngtown who were being ousted for harboring their own grandchild, who had been the victim of abuse. His last place to return to was his grandparents living in Youngtown. The community, in shades of the Scarlet Letter, planted a sign on their lawn saying harboring children and fine them $100 a day for this great offense. The New York Times pointed out that dogs were legal at Youngtown, not children. So is it any surprise after all of this effort to separate people in every aspect of life, in work, in communities, in housing by chronological age, that there's talk about ageism, that there's worry about conflict, that we have an epidemic of loneliness with younger people and older people at the top of that list. This is a grievous wound that we've inflicted upon ourselves. But again, without invoking that everything will work out in the end, I'll say that I'm really heartened by a movement that is underway all around the world today that is turning that around. If we rerouted the river of life, organized society in a way that goes against the grain of human nature, there's essentially a back to human nature movement that I see here in the UK, in the US, in Asia, elsewhere in Europe, of people who are trying to reorganize daily life in a way that creates proximity between the generations. Probably the most dramatic experiment underway is in Singapore. I'm sure some of you have heard about their aging plan, where they're investing $3 billion in an effort to recreate a kampong for all ages, with kampong being the Malay word for village, built around the notion of intergenerational harmony. They've essentially thought of everything and funded it. They have a 200 million Singaporean dollar innovation challenge that's underway, focused in part on bringing the generations together. They've mandated that every new senior center and preschool be co-located. They're creating 3-gen flats where families are able to live together and get benefits for doing so. A massive 100,000 person volunteer corps, most of older people, mostly focused on kids. And it's a very powerful example. But even here in the UK, I'm so taken with the work of Now Teach and what they're doing to bring older people into a classroom in a country where I believe last year or the year before only 100 of new teachers were over the age of 55. In the United States, there's essentially a great ferment of people, little by little, without anywhere near the kind of resources of Singapore or anything close to the kind of resources that Jim Mellon talked about this morning, that have gone into extending lives, but who still, nevertheless, are finding creative ways to bring the generations together. And you know, some are so commonsensical. I went to Cleveland last year in November to a place called Judson Manor, which is a senior living community that's near Case Western University. And when I showed up, there was a whole contingent of Swedish social scientists who were traveling to Cleveland in November to study new ways to bring the generations together. And they were there because at Judson Manor, they've created an artist in residence program where local graduate students in music at the Cleveland Institute of Music are given free living at Judson Manor in return for playing concerts. But through this proximity, there's not only music that's echoing through Judson Manor, but relationships are forming in enormously compelling ways. I met a 90-year-old woman there whose neighbor, a young violist, had married another violist while she was living there, and she asked her 90-year-old neighbor to be the maid of honor at their wedding. And that's just one example that I think shows how what oftentimes starts out as efficiency in the end produces something that can only be described as humanity, something that we've really been in danger of losing. I could go on and give you many more examples. One of them we'll talk about in the Life Transition section, which is the Encore Fellows program, which is essentially a gap year for grown-ups, a bridge year for grown-ups, where people work in an NGO half-time for a year. And while that was started out to be a life transition, a work transition vehicle, what it's turned out to be is an age integration vehicle, because so many of these Encore Fellows have ended up mentoring the executive directors of the organization. And to invoke another movie, The Intern, they've become sort of real-world examples of the intern, that role Robert De Niro played with the Anne Hathaway character. My friend Chip Conway has a new book out called Wisdom at Work, in which he describes that role as that of a modern elder. And I could talk about higher education, where at Stanford and Harvard and the University of Minnesota and soon Notre Dame, there are new education programs for the third stage of education, which are bringing older people into university classrooms to learn, but also to age integrate one of the last bastions of age segregation in society, which is higher education. I think all these efforts, while small, show us a different narrative, and we heard a lot about changing the narrative. It's an ethos that's focused instead on trying so hard to be young, to hang on to our fading youth, to be there for those who actually are, and a spirit of innovation that is every bit as bold and important as the innovation of the past century focused on splitting us apart, doing the opposite, bringing us together. And it's a reminder that the divide between the generations is fixable. We can fix it, and in the process, it can fix us and bring about the spirit we need more than anything else for the more old than young society, and that can be encapsulated in my favorite proverb, a Greek proverb, which says, "Society grows great when older people plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit." Thank you.